Welcome to our channel. Today we're diving into the surprising powers that FEMA holds during a crisis. And let me tell you, it's the kind of surprise that makes you want to check your basement for a bunker. You might think you know what FEMA can do, that it's all just handing out water bottles after a hurricane. And sure, they do that, but their authority goes way beyond that. We're talking about the kind of power that makes you wonder if maybe, just maybe, those conspiracy theorists with their tinfoil hats aren't so crazy after all. Don't worry, we're not going full conspiracy here, but buckle up because some of these powers will definitely surprise you. Let's get started. Alright, let's start with the stuff you probably already know, or at least have a vague idea about. When disaster strikes, FEMA swoops in, often with the National Guard in tow to provide essential supplies. We're talking food, water, medical supplies, the basics to keep people alive and, not rioting in the streets because they're thirsty and hangry. This is the FEMA we see on the news, the one that makes us feel all warm and fuzzy inside, like a government agency actually doing what it's supposed to do. And don't get me wrong, this is important work, but it's just the tip of the iceberg, my friends, the tip. Because what they don't always tell you is where all that stuff comes from. See, FEMA doesn't just magic it into existence. They have the authority to requisition it. And by requisition, I mean basically take it legally from businesses and individuals if they deem it necessary for the emergency response. Okay, so we've established that FEMA can take your bottled water and your Band-Aids. But what about, say, your car, your phone? Well, buckle up, Buttercup, because it turns out FEMA can take that too. Under certain circumstances, FEMA has the authority to seize personal property, including vehicles and electronics. It all boils down to something called the Stafford Act. This act gives the federal government broad powers to respond to disasters. Maybe they need your car to transport emergency personnel. Maybe they need your phone to establish a communication network. So, we've covered your physical belongings, but what about your cold hard cash? Or, your bank accounts, investments, that Bitcoin you're convinced will make you a millionaire one day? Well, I'm afraid I have some more potentially alarming news. FEMA can get their hands on that too. Yes, in certain situations, FEMA has the power to freeze or even commandeer financial assets. This power stems from the same source as their ability to seize property, the Stafford Act. The logic, at least on paper, is to prevent fraud and abuse of disaster relief funds. For example, if someone is suspected of fraudulently claiming disaster assistance, FEMA might freeze their assets to prevent them from, say, buying a yacht with taxpayer money. Sounds reasonable, right? But here's where things get a little murky. The definition of fraud and abuse can be pretty broad, and the process for freezing assets isn't always transparent. There have been cases where people have had their accounts frozen without warning, leaving them unable to access their own money for weeks or even months. Okay, so we've covered your physical possessions and your hard-earned cash. But what about something even more personal? Your information, your identity, your browsing history? Don't worry, I'm not judging your questionable late-night online shopping habits. Well, I'm afraid to say that FEMA has its sights set on that too. In the digital age, information is power, and FEMA knows it. They have the authority to collect and store vast amounts of personal information, including identification documents, medical records, financial data, and even communication records. The stated purpose? To verify identities, prevent fraud, and coordinate disaster relief efforts. And look, I get it. In the chaos of a natural disaster, having accurate information is crucial, but this vast data collection raises serious privacy concerns. What happens to all this information once FEMA has it? How long is it stored? Who has access to it? And what safeguards are in place to prevent misuse or abuse? FEMA can take your stuff, your money, and your data. But what about your time and skills? FEMA can requisition that too. In a crisis, they can draft you into service. Not full-blown conscription, but they can require certain services, like medical assistance if you're a doctor or nurse, or operating heavy machinery if you're a construction worker. The idea is everyone needs to pitch in during a major crisis. We've talked about FEMA's power to take your stuff, your money, your data, and even your time. But what about your voice, your ability to communicate with the outside world? Well, hold on to your modems, folks, because it turns out FEMA can mess with that too. In certain situations, they have the authority to seize or restrict the use of communication devices, including phones, radios, and internet services. Now, before you start crafting tinfoil hats and practicing your semaphore, let's be clear. This power is not meant to be used lightly. It's supposed to be reserved for extreme circumstances where communication networks are compromised, or there's a risk of widespread panic and misinformation. For example, in the aftermath of a major earthquake or cyber attack, FEMA might need to temporarily take control of communication infrastructure to coordinate rescue efforts or prevent the spread of harmful rumors. But as with all of FEMA's powers, there's a fine line between necessity and overreach. Restricting communication, even temporarily, can have a chilling effect on free speech and access to information. We've covered a lot of ground so far, but let's talk about something even more fundamental: your access to essential utilities. You know, the things that keep your lights on, your water running, and your house from turning into a sauna in the summer. Well, brace yourselves, because FEMA can mess with those too. In a crisis, they have the authority to control or limit access to electricity, water, gas, and other essential services. Now, before you start stockpiling candles and digging a well in your backyard, let me explain. This power isn't about plunging the country into darkness for kicks. It's about prioritizing resources and ensuring that critical infrastructure remains operational during an emergency. For example, in the aftermath of a hurricane, FEMA might need to divert power from residential areas to hospitals or emergency shelters. Or, in the event of a major drought, they might need to ration water usage to conserve dwindling supplies. But as always, there are potential downsides. Cutting off utilities, even temporarily, can have a devastating impact on people's lives. We've seen how FEMA can impact individuals, but what about businesses, those engines of capitalism that keep the economy humming? Well, hold on to your stock options, folks, because FEMA can meddle in the business world too. In a crisis, they have the authority to commandeer businesses or redirect their operations, effectively turning private companies into temporary government contractors. Now, before you start drafting angry letters to your congressman and converting your 401k into gold bars, let me explain. This power isn't about some socialist takeover of the private sector. It's about leveraging existing resources and expertise to respond to emergencies quickly and effectively. For example, FEMA might contract with a construction company to clear debris or repair damaged infrastructure, or they might direct a trucking company to transport supplies or evacuate residents. But as with all of FEMA's powers, there are potential downsides. Commandeering businesses can disrupt normal operations, lead to financial losses, and even put companies out of business. It can also create uncertainty and discourage investment, which can harm the economy in the long run. We've seen how FEMA can impact your belongings, your finances, your data, and even your business. But what about that most sacred of spaces, your home? Well, brace yourselves, because FEMA can even get involved in your domestic arrangements. In a crisis, they have the authority to requisition private property, including homes and apartments, for use as emergency shelters. Now, before you start building a moat around your house and investing in a trebuchet, let me explain. This power isn't about kicking families out of their homes on a whim. It's about providing temporary shelter to those who have been displaced by a disaster. And it's typically used as a last resort when other options, like hotels or community centers, have been exhausted. And in most cases, homeowners are compensated for the use of their property. But as always, there are potential downsides. Being forced to evacuate your home, even temporarily, can be traumatic and disruptive. We've covered a lot of ground, from seizing your snacks to commandeering your companies, but believe it or not, FEMA's bag of tricks is even deeper than that. They have a whole arsenal of lesser-known powers, each one more eyebrow-raising than the last. For example, did you know that FEMA can establish temporary morgues? It's a grim reality of disasters, but someone has to deal with the unfortunate souls who don't make it. And FEMA, bless their hearts, is authorized to step in and provide this essential, albeit morbid, service. They can also declare areas off-limits, essentially creating exclusion zones where only authorized personnel are allowed. This is meant to protect people from hazardous conditions, but it can also raise concerns about transparency and accountability. What's happening in those off-limits areas? Why can't the public access them? These are questions that deserve answers, even in the midst of a crisis. So, there you have it, a glimpse into the surprising and sometimes unsettling powers of FEMA. It's enough to make you want to invest in a bunker, a stockpile of ramen noodles, and maybe a tinfoil hat for good measure. But before you spiral into a full-blown panic, remember this: knowledge is power. By understanding FEMA's authority, we can better prepare for emergencies, protect our rights, and hold our government accountable. Thanks for watching. If you found this video informative, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more content. Stay safe and stay informed.